Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Well, good morning again.
Good morning.
It's good to see you all out here today. Thank you for coming out on St. Patrick's Day. I see a number of you are wearing the green. Before we begin, it's always interesting and exciting when you try something a little different, like the Lenten live stream. It's particularly exciting when you do something a little differently, not realizing what might happen. And I fired up the computer at the last minute as I was busy with other things, and Windows has graced us with a new feature. It thinks it would be wonderful to bring up to you little things you might want to look at. It brings them up on the side, and it goes ping every time it brings one up. And you can shut them down by clicking on them. And then ping, it does it again. This is not good when you're broadcasting live. It took me about 10 of those before I realized if I just leave it alone, it'll go away. So much fun learning new things. But that's how we move forward together in the world. And we're going to try some different things as we go along. Some of them will work great. Others of them we'll have to learn as we go. So, got a couple of questions for you this morning, things to ponder. How often, when you were all by yourself, did you have an idea that seemed in your head to be really great? And you ran off to find somebody, and you said it out loud, and suddenly it doesn't sound so great anymore. The other person's looking at you kind of funny. Yeah, sometimes being left to our own devices can lead to folly. Which is why the Bible states over and over again that humanity ought to be in community. That we're made for community. That way, when we have some of those good ideas, we can talk to somebody else about it, and they can say, ooh, you might want to rethink that before we actually go out and try it. How many times, now I'm going to ask parents or owners of pets, it goes the same way with either one on this particular question. How many times have you been sitting around and all of a sudden you jump up because things have gotten quiet? Too quiet. And you realize you've left that child or that pet to its own devices for a little too long. How many of you have had that experience? Yeah. I even saw it in a mama panda bear who was sitting there quite quietly, and behind her was her cub, and all of a sudden she just jumped and wheeled around and glared at it, because I think it had been quiet for a little too long. What are you doing back there? So these things happen. Well, Jesus would soon be forced against his will to leave an entire city to its own devices. And we're going to see that that wasn't a terribly good thing that was coming. Jesus had been stirring things up, as Jesus so often managed to do. He healed a woman in the synagogue on the Sabbath from a crippling condition that had been bothering her for many years. The leaders of the synagogue were upset because Jesus has broken a rule. He has healed on the Sabbath. He's done work on the Sabbath, and the rule said you don't do that. Well, Jesus had it. This is one of those things they might have wanted to think through before they said it out loud, especially to Jesus. Because Jesus says, you hypocrites. And anyone who is a religious leader, that is the last thing in the world that you want to be called is a hypocrite. Well, that's what he did. He says, now look, on the Sabbath day, you will still water your ox or your donkey. So why shouldn't a daughter of Abraham, who's been suffering for years, held in bondage, he said, for 18 years, be healed on the Sabbath? Isn't she worth more than a donkey or an ox? Shouldn't she receive help? The crowd loved it, and the leaders were left in shame. Jesus goes on to say, when asked who would be saved, this was a question that came up quite frequently. Who exactly would be saved? Well, he said, well, the first will be last and the last will be first. And, well, leaders, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and Herod himself, they considered themselves first. And they were none too happy with this switch in fortune here, this change of the order of things in Jesus' teaching. And perhaps they would become violently unhappy with Jesus. And so the Pharisees came to Jesus after all this, and they said, Herod is interested in you. And Herod's interest was never a healthy thing for somebody. This was a leader who was not known for being benevolent. And Jesus didn't know exactly whether or not they were genuinely concerned for his safety, considering the friction between them, or if they would just prefer to have this person who'd been stirring things up amongst their congregants, that they would just get him out of town, out of the region, in fact, because Herod, Galilee was his place. He didn't have any control of that, so they were hoping that he would go, get out of Galilee altogether. Having Herod's interest and hearing that he wanted you dead, this was never good news. After all, it was Herod who killed John the Baptist, and he did this during a party where he and his buddies watched his own daughter dance, and he was so enthused by the dance, he told her, anything you want, I will give it to you. She conferred with her mother and came back and said, we want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And since he was amongst his friends, and he didn't want to back down and be embarrassed amongst them, well, John lost his head. This is a family who was known for their cruelty. And Jesus, though, when he hears about it, he does not scurry away in fear. He does not cower, he does not hide. Instead, he acts as the prophet that he was, and he spoke out. And he spoke truth to power. And he begins with calling Herod a fox. And back in the day, that doesn't mean you're sly. That doesn't mean you're clever. What being a fox meant back in Jesus' day was that you are worthless or slanderous. You're treacherous or cunning in a very low and unscrupulous way. So Jesus is really letting Herod know how he feels when he calls him a fox. Also, foxes were known, and people watched nature very closely back in this period. They weren't as separated from the natural world as we tend to be now. And they observed very carefully what was going on around them, particularly when something around you might be able to eat you. It does focus your attention. And so they watched how foxes and lions interacted, and a fox would stay near lions, and when they made a kill, the fox would use its cunning, its low craftiness, to dash in at a moment when they weren't looking and steal some food for itself and run off and eat it, and hopefully not get clobbered by the lions on the way in or out. This is what foxes did. And so, in calling Herod a fox, he's saying that you are skulking around Caesar's lion. And frankly, the only reason you haven't been dealt with, nuisance that you are, is that you're just not worth it. Needless to say, Jesus is not going to be in Herod's favor by anything that he said here, and all in that one short phrase. So, he is speaking truth to power, which was never welcome. And delivering truths that people don't want to hear. It's part of the job of being a good prophet. It's truths like this that threaten people's ways of life. It threatens their sources of power. And it could lead to death if the truly powerful felt threatened enough by what the prophet was saying. And Jesus tells the Pharisees at this point, I'm going to be about my own business of healing and delivering the good news today and tomorrow, no matter what. I don't care what you people have on your agendas. I don't care what Herod thinks. This is what I'm going to be doing. Jesus states clearly he must be about his business, which is God's business. And he knows he's heading for Jerusalem. And he knows his destination. Well, he knows it in two ways. He knows this is his final destination, and he knows this is the location of his death. How many of you are aware that Jesus used sarcasm? Yep, sarcasm. He does it in this set of verses. And he says you got to go to Jerusalem because it's impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. So that's where he's going. He knows what he's going for. Being a prophet was a truly unpopular job. Speaking the truth from God, pointing out where people have gone astray from God's plan, that's not something people generally want to hear. And Jerusalem had an unhealthy habit of murdering prophets they didn't want to hear from. And they would continue to have that habit moving forward. Jesus fully expects the same. He has riled up the authorities everywhere he has gone. But prophets also offer hope. And Jesus had a great deal of hope to offer, especially with the resurrection to come. Jesus' work would not be done until the crucifixion and resurrection had been completed. Compared to Herod's threat, that was as insignificant to Jesus as a little fox yip compared to a lion's roar. Jesus' work won't be undone in crucifixion either, but that is what Rome and the religious leaders were hoping for. Nail him to the cross and all his disciples just go away. It's happened before with leaders they didn't want. They figured that'll happen again, but it's not true. Jesus' work will be completed there. Jesus might use sarcasm when he was speaking of Jerusalem and what awaits him there. But that sarcasm didn't let him become sour on the people. And hopefully this is good news for us, because when we mess up, Jesus won't sour on us either. For all Jesus did, there were things that he could not and would not do. As God won't force us to love God, for us, God won't force us to have faith in God. God refuses to create little adoring robots of us. Neither would Jesus. In Jesus' own hometown of Nazareth, he could not perform miracles that he had performed elsewhere because the hometown crowd refused to believe that their own hometown boy could ever be the Messiah. Not the carpenter's son. Come on now, that's as low a job as you could get. Surely not him. Jesus, for all the miracles he had done, for all his powerful teachings, for his many followers and disciples and apostles that he had gathered, he could not force anyone to change their mind. He could not coerce them into following him, no matter how strongly he loved them. Jesus regrets his inability to reach the hardened hearts of the people of Jerusalem. The city that holds God's own temple would not listen to God's word through Jesus. Jesus spoke of his love for Jerusalem's people. You can imagine him saying, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," with tears rolling down his face. And he adds, "How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing." Long has this image of God's wings protecting God's people or protecting Gentiles who come to God been a favorite image amongst them. It harkens back to the way that a mother hen will actually shelter her young under her wings during a storm for protection, placing her own body between her tender chicks and the harsh weather around them. This is the imagery that's been applied to God, and Jesus now applies to himself. As the people of Jerusalem rejected Jesus and all that Jesus offers, Jesus then states something that is the scariest thing for them. Although you don't notice it when you read it, he says, "See, your house is left to you." And what that means is you're being left to your own devices, Jerusalem. You have rejected me. You have turned from God. You will now stand alone. Not with God. Not with me. You're going to face the storm by yourself. And the storm is coming. In 66 AD, the Israelites would rebel against Rome. In 70 AD, Jerusalem would be destroyed, along with it the temple of God. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Your house is left to you. Accepting God's plan for life, Jesus calls us all to live as disciples, to love God and all of our neighbors equally, as you've heard me say time and time again. To love the marginalized and the poor, those from foreign lands, to be kind and to be loving in all of our decisions. And the consequences of our decisions are ours to own as well. That's one thing this story tells us. It's best to come under Jesus' covering wings, Jesus' love and guidance, instead of being left to our own devices. Terrorists, members of hate groups, they seek to divide society because they know society is weaker when it's divided. They want us to be filled with hatred and fear. They want us left to our own devices. In Louisville, Kentucky, a 17-year-old man was arrested after he vandalized a Hindu temple, defacing the statues and spray painting racist slogans on the walls. Now, this is mild compared to what happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, but there it is. And the community, instead of dividing, they came together by the hundreds across all ethnic and political and religious lines to help clean and restore the temple, to help elevate that part of their hurting community. They were responding as Jesus would have responded, drawing their community tighter together, not leaving the temple to its own devices, and a community hopelessly divided. In Ethiopia, the Orthodox churches there have not succumbed to community pressure. With a growing population, much of their forested land has been denuded and turned over into farmland. It's not that different from what happened in the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which led to the Dust Bowl days in the Midwest, our breadbasket. The land was literally dried out and blown away between logging and farming. So, but the churches there see forests as symbolic of heaven on earth. And if you walk through a forest on a cool day and enjoy the solitude, you can see that easily enough. And they decided that the forests encircling their churches would remain. And ecologists are helping them to protect it and to document the startling biodiversity that's found within these little circular patches of forest that surround these churches. And these churches are being really good stewards of their forests, and there are 35,000 of them throughout the country. Roughly half the population is Orthodox Christian. And they go to these churches where the land has not been left to its own devices because of the faith of their leaders. Jesus loves us all. Jesus wants to enfold us in his protection, to guide us to a rich and free life that God intends for every human being. But it's up to us to decide to follow Jesus or end up under the lament, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, and be left to our own devices. May each of us review this during this Lenten season where we stand and choose where we shall stand and how we will live. Let's pause for a moment of silence. Amen. Please rise as you're able for